everybody, Mike and Hannah here with Delta Faucet. Today, we're gonna show you how to install the Delta Clarifi tankless reverse osmosis system. Now, before we jump into this installation, let's talk about a few things that you'll need to know. First, you'll need a hole in your sink or countertop to install your beverage faucet. Now, the beverage faucet must be installed before starting the reverse osmosis system. If you haven't done that yet, don't worry, we have a separate installation video to walk you through those steps.
Also, check to make sure you have an available outlet near your installation location. It's important to note that the outlet should not be connected to a switch. It needs to have constant power. If you don't already have an outlet in the desired location, we recommend contacting an electrician to have one installed. They will have the expertise to safely and properly install the outlet for you according to local building codes. Now, keep in mind that building codes are different everywhere. For the scale and components of this project, we recommend using a licensed professional electrician and plumber. It's important to note that drilling directly into the drain pipe will be necessary.
To ensure a successful installation, we also advise referring to the installation instructions in the box for the dimensions of the unit to determine if it will fit in your desired location. Now, as a reminder, the unit must be installed in an upright position.
Additionally, make sure to choose a suitable location for installation. Avoid areas where the temperature may drop below freezing or where the unit may be exposed to direct light or heat. Finding the right spot will help protect the system and allow for easy access when it comes time to change the filters and cartridges. We have a separate video that shows you how to do just that, so be sure to check it out.
We'd also advise you have your incoming water supply tested. This will help ensure that the water is suitable for use with the reverse osmosis system. It's crucial to emphasize that this system is designed for potable water only, and it is important to only supply the water system with cold water.
In this video, we'll also show you how to install the optional remineralizer. The remineralizer cartridge is designed to give the water an enhanced pH, which some people prefer the taste of. Note that this does not come with the system and is an additional purchase.
Now that we've covered all of that info, let's click the tools and supplies we'll need to complete this installation. You will need a drill, a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 of an inch drill bit, a screwdriver, a bucket, an adjustable wrench, a towel for some light water cleanup, a tape measure, a Pex Cutter, a pencil, some silicone sealant, and of course, some safety glasses. All right, now that we've gathered all those supplies, let's jump into the installation. The first step is going to be installing our T adapter into our cold water supply that supplies our faucet underneath the sink here. Now to do this, I have the T adapter, which comes included with your system. I have a small adjustable wrench, and then also a towel for some light water cleanup in case any of those supply lines have some drips that fall out of them. So at this point, I've gone ahead and turned off the hot and the cold water supply lines here underneath my faucet, and then also turned my faucet handle into the full mixed position. This means halfway between hot and cold. That should relieve any residual pressure that may be stored up in those supply lines. Once there's no more water running out of your faucet, we can move underneath the sink and begin installing our T adapter. Next, let's take a moment to check out our T adapter here that comes included with your system. On the side of the adapter itself, you'll see it has a little indicator arrow that indicates the flow of water through the adapter. So we want to make sure that the bottom here is the side we're connecting to our cold water supply stop here under the sink. Also on the supply stop itself, you'll see the supply line coming down from your faucet and connecting to the supply stop. Now here in my installation, I have a Delta Touch faucet installed, which means I have this additional little check valve. That's totally fine if yours at home looks a little bit different. The installation steps are going to be exactly the same. So to begin, I'm going to take my adjustable wrench and disconnect my supply lines and my check valve if I have it from my cold water supply stop. Now that we have everything disconnected, we can move on to installing our T adapter to our cold water supply stop. Now, a little bit of a pro tip here is if you do have that Delta Touch faucet with the additional check valves, I find it's easier to go ahead and install the check valves to the top of my T adapter now before installing the T adapter to the cold water supply stop. Makes things just a little bit easier. Now, if you don't have those additional check valves, that's totally fine. Just skip forward a couple seconds to the spot where we start installing the T adapter directly to the supply stop. So for those check valves, I want to make sure I have this little additional piece that I sit into the top of my T adapter, and then I bring down the check valve over the top of the T adapter and gently hand thread it onto the top of the T adapter, making sure I'm not cross threading or anything feels like it's binding. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and hand tighten that up. And then to ensure a nice watertight connection, I'm going to use my adjustable wrench and rotate this check valve one more full turn. My adjustable wrench, and then just rotate it one more revolution or until I feel it get nice and snug. Now it's important here, I don't want to over tighten this connection, I just need it snug enough to ensure that it's nice and watertight. All right, now that I have my T adapter ready to go, I can move on to installing it onto my supply stop. So I'm gonna take my T adapter, bring it over to my supply stop, and then gently hand thread the nut down onto the stop itself. I'm gonna do this until it gets a little bit snug. And then again, I'm gonna use my adjustable wrench, except this time I'm gonna do a quarter turn to ensure a nice watertight connection. All right, that's looking great. Now at this point, I wanna point out that you'll notice I'm not using any sort of thread tape or additional sealant to help make these connections watertight. Everything's made from within the connections themselves. So this time, I'm gonna take my faucet supply line and connect it to the top of my T-stop. So here's my faucet supply line. Just like before, I'm gonna put it on top of my check valve in this case, or on top of the T-stop, depending on your configuration. And then gently begin tightening the nut onto the top of the adapter or the check valve. Once that feels nice and snug, I'm gonna use my adjustable wrench, and again, give it one more full turn, or until I feel like it's snug. All right, all of our connections are made and things are looking great under here. Now at this point, there's one final point that I really want to stress, and that's making sure that our T adapter is in the off position. So to confirm this, I just want to check my T adapter valve handle, making sure it's perpendicular to the flow of water coming out the side of the T adapter. Once that's in the off position, I can turn on my hot and my cold supply stops, and then check for leaks at all those connection points that we just made. Once everything's looking good, we can move on to the next step of the installation. Moving right along, we can next install our saddle drain. Now the way the saddle drain works is it basically comes in two pieces and is going to clamp around your existing drain line under the sink, which will allow the wastewater from the system to flow through the saddle drain and then down into your existing drain line. Now there's a few important things to note about the saddle drain itself. The saddle drain that comes included with your system can only be installed on a 1.5-inch drain line. So if your drain line underneath the sink here is a little bit different size, you will need to go to the hardware store to buy an adapter that works for your configuration. Next, we want to make sure that the saddle drain is installed before the P-trap on a smooth and straight surface. Also, you can install the saddle drain either on a vertical pipe or on a horizontal pipe. Now I do want to point out that if you install it on a horizontal pipe, we want to make sure that the hole for the saddle drain comes directly from the top of the drain line. That'll allow that wastewater to flow directly down into your main drain line and out. So, next thing I want to do is use the half of my saddle drain where my drain connection is going to be made and test fit a location. Now in my application here, I've got a nice spot, again, before the P-trap, smooth and straight, right on the side here. Once I'm happy with the location, I'm going to use a pencil to mark where I need to drill that hole. Now one thing I want to point out here is I also want to consider where that drain line is going to be coming from. For my application, my system's going to be sitting on the right side of my cabinet, so I'm going to have my drain line generally facing in that direction. However, I also want to make sure that I'm going to have enough room to make any of those connections in later steps, so just make sure you're giving yourself enough clearance to make those connections with wherever you locate that saddle drain. Once you're happy with the location, you can hold it in place with one hand. I've got a pencil here, I'm just going to use that to mark the location of that hole that I need to drill. And now, I know exactly where I want to drill that hole for the saddle drain. Now the hole we're going to be drilling is 3/8 of an inch. And another little pro tip here is I think it's easier to go ahead and drill a smaller pilot hole first, say like 1/8 of an inch, which will help make sure that 3/8 of an inch drill bit stays exactly centered as we drill into the curved surface of the drain. And also we want to be very careful to make sure we're only drilling through the one side of the drain and not all the way through the other side as well. So once everything looks good, let's go ahead and drill that hole for the saddle drain, and then we'll move on to the next step. With our hole drilled, now we can install our saddle drain. So the first step is using this included little gasket. You'll see one side has the adhesive backing on it, so I'm gonna go ahead and peel off that protective backing to expose the adhesive. And then this is gonna be placed on the inside of the saddle drain, line up those two holes exactly. So again, the adhesive side towards the saddle drain, perfectly center it over that hole, press it down into place like so. Next, we're gonna place that saddle drain over the hole that we drilled like this, and clamp it in place with the two sides of the saddle drain and then the included nuts and bolts. I think it's easiest to go ahead and preload one of the nuts into the back of the saddle drain. You can see it's got a little indent that the nut fits in to hold it into place. I'm going to hold that in place with my finger. And then with the other side, the saddle drain with that gasket we just applied, use one of the bolts to begin threading that into place by hand. At this point, I'm just going to use my fingers or a screwdriver to kind of get it not tight or snug yet, but just enough that it's going to kind of stay in place. Okay, we're getting pretty close on that side. You can see I still have a little bit of freedom movement here. At this point, a little bit of a pro tip is to use either your pencil or your screwdriver. Carefully place it through the side of the saddle drain until you feel it go into the hole that we drilled previously. That way I can confirm that I'm correctly aligned with the saddle drain and the hole on the side of the main drain. Once I'm happy with that location, I'm going to hold that in place and then snug it all the way up by continuing to tighten those bolts on each side. At this point, I don't need to over tighten this, I just need enough to make sure it's snug and make a nice watertight connection between the saddle drain and the main drain line itself. Okay, you can see with a little bit of force it's not moving at all, so now I'm confident that I've made a nice connection between my drain with my saddle drain.
All right, I've gone ahead and dry fit our unit into place in the cabinet where I want it. Now I've specifically placed it here because it's directly under our beverage faucet, and it'll allow my hoses to reach the unit and my pre-filter and my remineralizer if you're choosing to use one at home. You just want to make sure you don't have a large distance between these items so that the hoses still reach everything. Okay, now we're going to mount our pre-filter. So that is this, and before we do this, we have to figure out where we want to place it. So I am using the remineralizer. This is sold separately, and I'm going to place this right about here to the left of our housing unit. So that leaves room for my pre-filter right about here. Now, another thing to consider when you place this is what's behind the walls. You want to make sure you're not going to drill into any plumbing or electrical, and if you're placing it on a sidewall, you want to make sure you're not going to drill into an appliance like a dishwasher or into the cabinet next to it. All right, so this is mounted with a C-clip. Mounts on just like that, this side up. So we're going to place it in the cabinet here, right where we talked about earlier. And I'm going to take a pencil here and just make a reference mark right on the side. Okay. Now I'm going to slide this C-clip down just like that and place it right on that reference mark we just made. And I'm going to take a pencil and make a mark for my pilot hole. Okay, now that we have that marked, it's time to drill a pilot hole. So we've got our pilot hole drilled. Now I knew that I was gonna hit a stud, so I used an 1/8 inch drill bit. If you have a hollow wall and you know you need to use the included anchor, then you'll wanna use a 1/4 inch drill bit. Okay, now it's time to mount our C-clip. So I'm gonna take the screw here and preload it and take a drill bit here with a Phillips bit on the end. I'm gonna go ahead and just hand screw it on just to get it started. Okay, now we're gonna tighten it down. All right, so we've got our C-clip mounted for our pre-filter. Now I'm gonna hold off on installing the pre-filter and move on to installing the C-clips for our remineralizer. Now, if you're not using a remineralizer, you can go ahead and move on to the next step. If you are, it's very similar to the steps that we just did for the pre-filter. The only difference is that the remineralizer uses 2 C-clips, and you're going to put the first C-clip right above this top ridge here. They just snap on, and then the bottom C-clip goes right below this bottom ridge here. And one thing that you want to consider before mounting is that there will be tubes coming out of the top and the bottom, so you just don't want to mount it too low. All right, let's get to it.
Now at this point, we can begin making the connections from my T-adapter to the bottom of our pre-filter, and then from our pre-filter to our system. So to make these connections, I'm gonna be using the 2 white hoses that come included with your system and are 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Now I notice one hose is a little bit longer at 39 inches, and then the second hose is shorter at 20 inches. So to start, I'm going to take the longer hose, and I'm gonna be placing it, connecting it to my T-adapter. So to do this, I'm gonna unscrew the nut on the side of the T-adapter, and then slip the nut over the end of my hose, making sure that the threads of the nut are still facing my T-adapter, and then push the end of the hose onto the nipple of the T-adapter here. All right, once I have that hose pushed firmly up against the edge of the T-adapter, I can slide my nut back over the threads and then begin hand tightening it into place. And once that's snug, I think it's a good idea to take my adjustable wrench and give that another half turn or so, just to ensure that's a nice watertight connection. Now we've made the initial connection, we can move on to flushing our lines, which means basically running some water through my tube here from the T-adapter for say about 10 seconds to clear any debris that may have gotten in there during the installation process. So I've got my bucket here, and when I'm ready, I'm gonna go ahead and turn on my T-adapter to allow water to flow. Okay, now that we have that line flushed, we can move on to connecting that hose to the bottom of my pre-filter. So on the pre-filter itself, I do want to point out, you'll see there's a big arrow that says flow, that indicates the flow of water. So I want to make sure that I'm connecting the hose from my T-adapter to the bottom of my pre-filter. I'm going to remove this plug off the bottom, and you'll see this connection here at the bottom is a push connector. So I'm going to be pushing the hose fully into the bottom of the pre-filter until I see this little reference line here fully disappear. So I'm just going to line it up, hold it straight, and then with a little bit of pressure, I can fully seat the hose into the bottom of the pre-filter. And I think it's a good idea to give it just a little bit of a tug down to ensure that it's locked in there fully. Now, just so you know, these push connectors, if you ever need to release them, you can always hold your finger tight on that outer ring there, and that will loosen it enough that you can pull the hose straight out from the connection. However, in this case, I want to make sure that I keep this in place. So once I'm happy with the connection, I'm going to use a locking plate to clip over the bottom of that push connector, which ensures that the hose can never be accidentally removed. Now, same steps for the top of my pre-filter here. Remove the plug. Take my shorter length of hose here, again pushing it straight down until I see that reference line fully disappear. And then once I'm happy with the connection, use another locking plate from the side to lock that hose into place. And then finally, I'm going to use the end of the hose coming from the pre-filter and connect it into the back of my system. Now you notice in the back of the system, I have 3 areas that I could be connecting this to. I want to make sure I'm going in the middle one, the biggest, that says in. So I'm going to remove the plug that's in there now. And again, this is a push connector, so you can hold the outer ring down with a finger, pull out the plug, and I'm going to take the end of my hose coming from my pre-filter, line it up in the back of the system, and then push it straight down into my push connector until I see that reference line fully disappear. And then finally, take another one of my locking plates, lock it around the ring of that push connection to ensure that it's locked into place. Now that we have our pre-filter connected, we can move on to connecting our waistline. Now we can move on to connecting the waistline from our system to our saddle drain. Now there's 2 ways this can be accomplished. If your faucet that you're installing the system on has an integrated air gap, like mine does here, I'm gonna walk you through those installation steps. We're actually gonna be connecting the system waistline to our air gap, and then the air gap to the saddle drain. However, if your configuration at home doesn't have that integrated air gap, that's totally fine. Those installation steps are slightly different, so I'm gonna walk you through those next. So, for a faucet with an air gap, you'll see you should have 3 hoses coming down from the bottom of your faucet. Now here I'm installing this on a Delta one, so your hoses may look similar. However, whatever type of faucet you're installing this on, there should be some way that they've labeled each one of these hoses, so just be sure to keep an eye on that. The first hose we're going to be using is the drain line from the air gap to our saddle drain. So this is my thicker line here, my 3/8 inch white line. And what I want to do is I want to kind of dry fit my line here, making sure it's traveling from the air gap into my saddle drain. And I want to pay close attention to make sure that this line doesn't have any dips or loops or kinks in it, because I want to make sure gravity pulls all that water down from the air gap into my saddle drain. Now, here I've installed my saddle drain on a vertical pipe. However, if you had it installed on a horizontal pipe, same idea. We would just want to make sure that drain line didn't have any kinks or dips in it. So I'm going to hold the drain line kind of dry fit next to my saddle drain here, making sure that there's no dips again. And I'm going to have to cut the line to length, so I'm going to take a pencil to mark that location that I want to make my cut at. Okay, now that I have that location marked, I'm going to go ahead and cut it with my Pex cutters. And I want to be very careful to make sure I'm making a clean and straight cut when doing this. So again, keeping an eye on that reference line, lining it up, making sure I'm perpendicular with my tube, and making a clean cut. All right, now that we have that line cut, I think it's a good idea to go ahead and make a little reference line on the bottom of my drain tube here to make sure that I'm seating it fully inside of my saddle drain. So I'm gonna use a tape measure, hold my tube next to the tape measure. It's some reference line, I'm gonna use 3 inches for this one, and then come up 5/8 of an inch and make a reference line at that location. Just double check to make sure I'm sitting right at 5/8 of an inch, which I am. Now I can use that reference line as a guide when pushing my drain line into the saddle drain to ensure a good connection. I'll line it up with the saddle drain, again keeping an eye on that reference line, and then push the hose fully into the saddle drain until I see that line go away. Now that we have the air gap connected to our saddle drain, we can move on to connecting our system waste line to the air gap. Now back to the 2 lines coming down from my faucet here. Now for this specific faucet, that line's gonna be the 1/4 inch white tube. And just like before, I wanna mark this tube up 5/8 of an inch as well for a reference line to ensure that I'm making a nice connection. Now the different part with this tube is I don't need to cut it. Any dips or loops are totally fine in this instance. So I just need to make that mark at 5/8 of an inch on the bottom of the tube. So just like before, I'm gonna use my tape measure, line up the bottom of my tube with the reference line. In this instance, I'm using the 3-inch line, and then make a mark 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom of the tube. Now, just like before, for the input line, I'm going to go to my waste connection here, hold down the compression ring to remove the plug. I'm gonna take my air gap line, connecting it to the waste connection point, line it straight up, keep an eye on my reference line, and then push the tube firmly into place. All right, a little bit of a tug up to ensure a good connection, making sure that reference line is fully disappeared, and then locking it into place with another one of those locking plates. Okay, so that wraps up the installation steps if you're installing the system on a faucet with an integrated air gap. Now, if your faucet doesn't have an integrated air gap, let's take a quick second to run through those installation steps now. So if your beverage faucet doesn't have an integrated air gap, we're gonna be connecting the waste line from our system directly to our saddle drain. So the first step is going to be using the included saddle drain adapter, which is basically going to take the diameter of the saddle drain from 3/8 down to 1/4 inch. So I've got my adapter here, and I'm going to push it fully into my saddle drain, and I want to make sure it's fully seated at least 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to line up my saddle drain and then push it in with a little bit of force until I feel it fully seat into position. Now, just like my other connections, I'm going to use my locking plate to hold that little push ring locked into position. Now, to make the connection between the system and my saddle drain, I'm going to be using the included 1/4 inch red hose here. And you'll notice that each end of the hose comes pre-marked with those reference lines. So beginning with my saddle drain adapter, I'm going to bring my waste hose over, keep an eye on that reference line, and push it all the way in until that line disappears. A little bit of a tug to ensure a nice tight connection, and then lock it into place with another one of those locking plates. All right, now with the other end of the hose, I'm gonna be connecting this into my system. And this time I'm gonna connect it into the waste connection point. So first we're gonna remove the plug, holding down that compression ring and gently removing the plug. Then taking my waste line, again confirming I'm connecting it to the waste connection point. Keep an eye on that reference line and push the hose fully into the fitting. A little bit of a tug to ensure that it's connected well, and then lock it into place with another locking plate. All right, now that we have that waste line connected to our drain, let's go ahead and move on to hooking up our filtered water line. Now for our install here, I'm gonna be installing the optional remineralizer cartridge between my faucet and the system. Now, if you're not installing this optional product, that's totally fine. The only difference is you're gonna be making your connection from your faucet supply line directly to the back of the system at the filtered water connection point labeled pure. Now, if you are installing this cartridge, the first step is to remove the protective caps from the top and the bottom of the cartridge. These just pull right up and off, and we can set those off to the side. Next, we're gonna install the included elbows to the top and bottom nipples of the cartridge itself. Now, just like all the other connections, these are push fittings. Just place the elbow over the top of the nipple and then give it a little bit of pressure to push it down and make sure it's fully seated down to the bottom of the cartridge. Same steps for the bottom now. Take my elbow, slip it over the nipple, and then push it until it seats fully onto the cartridge. Next, I can set that off to the side for the moment, and we're gonna connect our tube, which is the white tube that's 1/4 inch, and again, you'll see it's pre-marked and came included with your system, to the back of the system itself. Now we're gonna go to our final connection point, the one that's labeled pure, that's the filtered water connection point. I'm gonna hold down the ring on the outside of that push fitting, and then pull out my plug. Next, I'm gonna take my tube, line it up with my connection point, keep an eye on that reference line, and push it all the way in until that line disappears. Give it a little bit of a tug, and then lock it in place with one of these locking plates. Now with that tube inserted, we're gonna take the other end of the tube and insert it into our remineralizer cartridge. Now I do wanna point out on the cartridge itself, you'll see at the bottom, it is directional. So you have a top and a bottom. You see the top arrow here, the one that's facing up, is labeled from the filter, that's our system. And then the bottom arrow at the bottom of the cartridge here is labeled to the faucet. So I'm taking the other end of the white tube that I connected to the system, and again, connecting to the top of the remineralizer cartridge into the elbow, keeping an eye on that reference line, and then pushing it in until that line disappears. With that connection made, I'm gonna take my locking plate and lock that connection in place like I have with the other ones. Next, I can move to the bottom of the cartridge. That's the spot that's gonna go and connect to our faucet on top of the sink. Take that tube, line it up with the elbow, and then push it in about 5/8 of an inch until it fully seats into the elbow connection. Give it a little tug, feels nice and secure, and then lock it into place with the locking plate. All right, now that we have all those connections made, we're almost ready for our initial system startup. Now there's a few things I wanna check before we do that. First, I wanna make sure that the unit sitting outside of the cabinet here is sitting on a level surface, perfectly upright. Next, I also wanna check the 2 filters on the front to make sure they're in the locked position, which is perfectly parallel with my floor here from side to side. Also, we wanna make sure that our beverage faucet on top of the countertop is in the off position. And once both those things look good, we can go ahead and supply water to our system by turning on the T adapter back at our cold water supply stop. Now that we have water supplied to the system and all our connections are made, we're just about ready to plug it in, which will start the initial system startup. Now this is gonna last for about 5 minutes, and you'll hear your system making some noises and the lights will come on the front, so don't be alarmed when you plug it in. Now once you plug it in, while that system startup is running, I think it's a great idea to go back and check each one of your connection points just to make sure you don't see any evidence of leaks that may need to be corrected at this point. So if everything looks good, let's go ahead and plug our system in and let it run that initial system startup. Okay, so our unit is going through its initial system startup. And now's a great time, as I mentioned before, to check for any signs of leaks along the back of my system here, my remineralizer cartridge, my pre-filter, and also my T-adapter back on my cold water supply stop, making sure I don't see any evidence of leaks. Also, something else to note here is you may see a little bit of dripping coming out the back of the air gap on the back of the faucet if your system had one. Don't be alarmed, that's totally normal. All my connection points are looking great, so we're gonna go ahead and let this system run and do its initial startup. And once everything quiets down, we'll come back here and start putting it underneath our sink.
All right, so we've gone ahead and put our housing unit in place in our cabinet, making sure it's on a flat, level surface, and also making sure that it's not touching the side of our cabinet wall here. That could cause some vibration and increase the noise level. You also want to make sure that when you push it back in your cabinet that you're not kinking any of the hoses. I've also gone ahead and clipped in our pre-filter and our remineralizer, and now it's time to flush our system. This is a really important step that you don't want to skip. The system does need to be fully saturated for it to perform optimally. So to do that, we're gonna turn on our beverage faucet, and it may spray a little bit of water. That's totally normal. It's just some air bubbles going out of the system. So we're gonna set a timer for 30 minutes, and if it goes over 30 minutes, at 33 minutes, the system will shut off on its own, it'll beep, and in that case, you'll just have to unplug it and then plug it back in.
All right, things are working and looking great, so that about wraps up this install.
If you have any questions about the lights and sounds on your unit, please refer to the user guide included in your packaging, or feel free to give Delta Faucet customer service a call. They're happy to help.